Hey, world geography students, we are going to continue our discussion on culture by finally talking about all those different types of culture that we mentioned, all those different aspects, and talk about how they move and change over time. This term we've already talked about a little bit before. We're going to take it and go a little bit more in depth, and that term is cultural diffusion. So we know that it's something that's going to move from one place to another. So let's take a look. All right, so before we talk about how something moves from one place to another, we have to understand that obviously it has to start somewhere. And we call that somewhere its hearth. A cultural hearth is an area where a specific cultural trait begins. That could be any type of cultural trait that we've mentioned before. It could be religion, it could be a language, it could be clothing style, a particular food. It could be anything that pertains to culture and where it began. If you look at ancient history, we have many areas in which you have areas where many cultural traits or part of our culture today developed. And you can see here in the map some of those regions here. One of the famous ones that you probably have heard of, the Fertile Crescent here in the Middle East, as well as the Nile Valley in Egypt, in some other areas around the world, even Mesoamerica, are where we get many of our cultural traits that we can trace back to ancient times. These were areas where innovation really kicked off after they had many different ways in which they could gain culture over time. These were also areas that were suitable to farming. They were all near water sources, fresh water sources, so mostly rivers. And this allowed them to be a more sedentary group of people and spend more time doing other things rather than just, hunting and gathering. And so now this gives them time to develop, written language or, artwork or music and, eventually things such as government and language. These things develop through these sophisticated lifestyles that these people led in these ancient worlds. All right, and from that cultural hearth, it took a long period of time to move out of these particular areas into other parts of the world because it was not a globalized society like we have today. Today's society, we have many different things that speed up the diffusion of culture and move it away from its hearth to around the world. But back then, you can imagine it took a long time to move out of the starting point with no cars or trains or internet, smartphones, things that we don't have during this time period. Really slowed down the diffusion of culture. And so culture developed very slowly over time until we start seeing the improved transportation and communication networks that we're seeing around the world. And so now we call that increased communication and transportation network globalization, and this increases over time. And so we're seeing more culture being produced every day as a result, and because of this increased globalization. So moving from its cultural hearth, we take a look at some of the types of diffusion. Again, this is how it spreads across the world or spreads across space. This could be a material culture item such as a phone or clothing style, or it can be something that is non-material like an idea such as a religion or a particular language. And how these things spread, there are a couple different ways. They obviously originated their hearth, and they do one of two things, generally speaking. The first thing they might do is evolve over time. This is something how it changes from one particular way to another. That would be possibly an example might be how eventually tea would go from being mostly green tea to later it would change over time to black tea, and then when it moved to the American South it became sweet tea that we see today. That's how not only it diffused, it moved from place to place, but also it evolved in these different places that it went to. So culture not only moves from place to place, it also changes internally. And you can see many different types of diffusion that geographers typically use. The first type being contagious, where it spreads person to person. And this is the most common. way in which people share culture is from person to person. Today, we see a lot of culture being diffused through things such as the internet, things like viral videos or memes, oftentimes spread quickly from person to person. And this is what we call contagious diffusion, the same way in which a disease or sickness might be contagious, same way for cultural ideas or material culture. So you can see that in a few of the examples here. Another type is hierarchical. Hierarchical diffusion is going to be something that spreads from the top down. All right, as in societies, typically you have people that are have higher status. Could be a celebrity or a politician, someone who has a little more fame or fortune. And when they start producing new types of culture, whether it be a song or a particular clothing style, oftentimes it spreads very quickly that way as well. Oftentimes people like to look to celebrities for or people in higher social standings for cultural trends, and so they try to adopt people that have higher social status in order to try to either imitate them or just be part of the mainstream culture that likes that particular cultural trait. And so hierarchical is very effective. That's why you see in commercials oftentimes they'll hire famous celebrities or politicians to do their commercials for them because they know people oftentimes relate to people that they know with higher social standing. And the final type that we're going to talk about is relocation diffusion. This is simply moving it from one place to another and trying to spread it. And this oftentimes happens when somebody moves from one place to another. A famous example that we've mentioned in here before is how Christianity spread. When explorers went from their locations in Europe out to the New World, it oftentimes with it brought their religion. And so moving to the New World and setting up colonies brought the spread of Christianity. And one of the reasons why we see Christianity spread around the world today is because of people moving to different places around the world during that colonization time period and later on the imperialism time. So this can also be seen in food culture, especially in the United States. You see people move here all the time, and that's where we get a lot of our variety in our diet today. You can find restaurants of many different types, whether it be Chinese, Italian, French, you name it. There's many different types from all over the world, foods in the United States. And that's because of people moving here and bringing that aspect of culture with them. So again, that would be a type of relocation diffusion where that cultural trait spreads because of somebody moving from one place to another. And these different cultural traits, can be spread in multiple ways, not just one. So these are just some of the ideas in which we look at it. All right. Finally, we're going to take a look at globalization, and I want to mention one way in which culture has spread throughout the years, and the number one way in which that's occurred is through trade, where they have certain things that one person has or another does not, and so oftentimes what people did, and still to do this day do, is trade with one another. I'll give you what I have as part of my culture, whether it be goods, certain foodstuffs, whatever the case may be, iPhones today, and you trade with other countries for goods that they have. And this way is another type of way that culture diffuses. And so you get material goods and non-material goods being transported between one group of people to another. And so you see this type of relocation and contagious diffusion that occurred. So trade has been the number one way in which throughout history people have had their culture diffused. You can see an example here of tea. So tea originally started in China. It originated in cultivation there between the border of China and India today. And over time, people from Europe would eventually get hold of this drink, tea. You can see here Marco Polo was the first one to introduce and talk about it. However, it didn't really catch on until the age of exploration many years later. And eventually it would become a favorite drink in Great Britain. Tea eventually would move from its original cultural hearth through diffusion to Great Britain. And then we also know that Great Britain had a colony in the Americas, which would eventually become the United States of America, where tea also has become very popular. and still is to this day. And one way in which it internally changed was through the evolution of adding sugar and icing it down in the South, which is what produced that cultural trait of sweet tea today. So from its hearth in China, tea has undergone many changes and has diffused to the drink that we now see today as sweet tea. There are many examples of this in the world. You can trace back many of its origins to other places around the world. The number one inhibitor or barrier to diffusion has been isolation. So if you can't reach somebody, then it is tough for them to develop or get this culture. And so we talked about this a little bit when we talked about pop versus folk culture. And so this diffusion is not getting to certain people like we talked about the Tibetans in the mountainous Himalayan region, Amazon tribes where it's also very remote, islanders that cannot receive many messages or don't get many visitors. And so diffusion is very slow to these places. And so oftentimes what happens is you don't have the popular culture in the places that are less isolated. But we are, as we talked about earlier, becoming more and more globalized every single day. And this is leading to more diffusion, and we're becoming even more of a global culture. And that will only continue to increase with the technology that we have. Eventually, we'll get to a point of acculturation where the dominant cultures in society will eventually create one particular global culture in many ways. And this is a slow process over time where the lesser cultures or the less dominant cultures eventually leave their culture and start adapting to the more dominant culture around the world. You can see this as the diffusion of American restaurants around the world or American businesses around the world. And these things eventually over time are going to create a more and more globalized society. And we're seeing that every day. So I'm going to challenge you to see if you can think of any other ways in which a culture or cultural trait has started and has moved or evolved and changed over time to the present cultural trait that we have today. So try to trace that origin back if you can. All right. Have a great day.